In January 1939, German Chancellor Adolf Hitler told the Reichstag for the first time that the Nazis intended to exploit war to annihilate Jewish people. The murder of 6 million Jews was commemorated on Friday, which was Holocaust Memorial Day. The focus this year was on normal people, the victims of genocide, the normal people who were witnesses and bystanders to genocide, and the normal people who became its perpetrators. I'm joined by Dr. Rachel Sentry, Deputy Chief Executive of Holocaust Memorial Day Foundation, Holocaust survivor Dr. Martin Stern, and author of A Village in the Third Reich, Julia Boyd. Martin, you must be very aware of the perpetration of the Holocaust by ordinary people and the bystanders and the witnesses who were ordinary people. Did you therefore approve of the focus this year on ordinary people?
I not only approved of it, I suggested it. There is a mass of evidence from people who have studied the Holocaust that the mass murderers started out as ordinary people. Ordinary policemen were taken off the street in Nazi Germany and sent to Poland to murder thousands and tens of thousands, and some of them went back into the police force as ordinary policemen afterwards. From that and a lot of other sources, we are intensely aware of this. And we want to get away from the idea of teaching history as a black and white issue of extremes, because without the people in between, the Nazis would have been powerless.
Yes, and how has that made you reflect on your fellow human beings? I mean, have you lived your life since being a Holocaust survivor thinking that the people around you now, the people who surround you in Britain, could be caught up in such events were history to take that sort of turn?
The answer has to be yes. There is an extraordinary upsurge in anti-Semitism, all kinds of hatred, and not only against Jews, other kinds of polarization and hatred are on the rise around the world, including Britain. And people in Germany lived through what seemed to be a democracy, but it collapsed like a soap bubble.
So the veneer of civilization is very, very thin, would be your analysis, I suppose, and any of us might be swept up in such a thing were the circumstances to present themselves.
The frightening thing is that, indeed, very ordinary people get drawn into it. I mean, we're using this year a graphic novel by a German graphic novelist. It is called Irmina. And it is about a young German woman who goes to London to improve her English and learn typing, and she, at a party, meets a black man who is being treated insultingly. She leaps to his defense. She is a better than average person. She goes back to Germany. Her husband turns out to be in the SS. She doesn't ask too many questions. When shops are being smashed and synagogues burnt, she doesn't ask too many questions. And in fact, she parrots the Nazi slogans to her little son. And after the war, she goes back to being a normal person and, in fact, meets this black student she met in the 1930s, and they have a conversation. It is exactly about ordinary people and how nuanced and subtle the reactions are. But without those, Nazism could not have occurred.
Rachel, tell me why it is important still to have Holocaust Memorial Day once a year.
It is so important for us all to remember the 6 million men, women and children who were murdered simply because they were Jewish, as well as the thousands, millions of other people murdered by the Nazis for all different reasons, just because the Nazis didn't like them or want them. But on Holocaust Memorial Day, we also remember the other genocides that have taken place in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur, all examples of people being targeted, persecuted just because of an aspect of their identity. And we know that there are places around the world today that are still at risk. One of the advantages of the theme, Ordinary People, is that we are all ordinary people and we all have choices to make today. We know that thousands of people all around the country came together on Holocaust Memorial Day, which was on Friday. They lit candles, placed them in their window at 4 p.m. to create a national moment to light up the darkness so that we remember what happened, remember all the people that were murdered, and stand up against racism, anti-Semitism and identity-based hatred today.
I didn't know that Holocaust Memorial Day also applied to these other genocides, and I personally am delighted to hear that, because I could see otherwise that the criticism would be, why focus on one genocide and not the others? So that is excellent news. How important, how widespread, Rachel, is Holocaust denial at the moment?
Unfortunately, Holocaust denial is very much on the increase, not only denial but also trivialisation. Social media platforms make it very easy for people to post anonymously, and also fake news, it's quite difficult for people to fact check. They sometimes share information without checking it. And that's why it's so important that we listen to survivors like Martin while they are still with us and hear their testimony from their mouths, their own words, and that we learn from them and remember it so that we can stand up against identity-based hatred, against racism, against anti-Semitism.
What does polling tell us about how widespread Holocaust denial is now? Do we know how many people simply disbelieve?
I think there was a Dutch poll that happened recently.
I thought it showed a quarter of some age group as being... Do you know the statistics?
Millennials, something like 38% didn't know how many people had died in the Holocaust, even remotely. A quarter of young people below about the age of 30 thought the Holocaust had not occurred. And there was a whole list of statistics, a bit complicated to remember, but it was in the Times, yes.
And deeply shocking. Now, Julia Boyd, let's for a moment talk about your book, A Village in the Third Reich. What was it you did in that book?
Well, I did exactly what Martin's been talking about. At least I tried to present a more nuanced picture than the one that I grew up with, which was, basically just monsters and heroes, and there was nothing in between. And the village proved to be a very good study for this. At first, I was worried that because it's right down on the Austrian border, it was too far away from the centre of action to be meaningful. But there really wasn't a single aspect of the war that you couldn't look at through this small Bavarian village's perspective. And, of course, the village had people across the whole spectrum. At one end, there were dedicated Nazis who remained so unto the bitter end, and at the other end, people who hated the Nazis, and in the middle, people who might have started out as very enthusiastic Nazis, but when they saw the real colour of the regime, changed their minds. The trouble was that you couldn't really change your mind. The grip of the Nazis was so intense. Their tentacles went into every last corner of German society. So if you woke up one morning and said, I don't like the Nazis anymore, I'm going to protest, you'd have ended up in Dachau. And even if you were very brave, what about your family who would have been left destitute? So it is a more nuanced picture, as I say, than the one that I grew up with. And I think looking at one village, certainly it's helped me to understand better the inconsistencies that Martin was talking about just now. You can do a good thing one day and then do a terrible thing the next. It's just all so complicated. But that, of course, doesn't take away from the total evil of the Nazi regime. Sorry.
No, not at all. But, for example, tell me a little bit about the mayor. There was a mayor of the village. Well, take it up from there.
Well, Ludwig Fink is a very good example of a person who started out very enthusiastic about the Nazis, partly because Germans were so humiliated after the First World War and with the Treaty of Versailles. And long comes Hitler, who says he's going to put Germany back at the top table of nations. And many people were seduced by this. But Ludwig Fink, who was the mayor of Oberstdorf, was basically a decent human being. And after a while, he saw that Hitler was not going to calm down as many people had thought once he got into power. And he couldn't really protest. A senior Nazi, he was in a senior position as mayor, he simply would have been sent to Dachau or killed. So he did his best to mitigate the evil as much as he could. He protected the Jews. There were very few, but the few Jews living in Oberstdorf. He protected the nuns. He did what he could to protect people from the worst excesses of the Nazis.
And of course, ordinary people suffered, even if, in terms of the Holocaust, they were simply bystanders or witnesses. But from that village, many of the young men, of course, died.
Yes. And, you know, the big question is, how much did ordinary Germans really know? And even in little Oberstdorf, right down on the Austrian border, 100 miles away from the nearest big city, Munich, people knew, I'm sure of it. For a start, the young men were coming back on leave. And although they wouldn't have been able to talk out publicly, they must have talked to their friends and their family about the terrible atrocities they'd witnessed on the East Front and possibly taken part in themselves. Just 10 miles north of Sonthofen, there was this Ordensburg, this Nazi-type castle, where people like Himmler came to brief Nazis in the area, and he certainly was there in 1944 briefing Nazis on the final solution. It's impossible to think that details of what he said then didn't leak out into Sonthofen and to Oberstdorf and the surrounding area. There were camps all around Oberstdorf. There was a Waffen-SS training camp which was run by prisoners taken from Dachau. There were labour camps. There were these sub-camps of the concentration camps. So everybody knew what was going on.
Difficult to be in ignorance. And quite briefly, tell me about the investigation at the end of the war when they come into the village and want to know how much of a Nazi you've been.
Very difficult to sort that one out. I mean, were you a Nazi? It's exactly like the lady that Martin was talking about. Were you a Nazi if you made if the headmaster, for instance, made robust Nazi speeches in the school, but he protected the Jewish children in the class? He wore an SA uniform, but he tried hard to keep a sense of humanity in his school. It's a very mixed picture. Of course, there were the out-and-out Nazis, and too many of them were let out. But there were people who, as I say, are part of this slightly inconclusive mix in the middle. One day they were a Nazi, the next day they were behaving like decent people.
Martin, what's your reaction to that picture that Julia paints of a particular village, probably quite typical of what was going on in Nazi Germany?
Well, in immediate post-war Germany, as a German citizen who had been involved in Nazism, you could go to the town hall and get a Persilschein, a Persil certificate. The advertising slogan for Persil washing powder was "Persil washes whiter."
You could clear your name.
Yes, and these people entered normal life and administrative and government roles, yes.
I don't know how many Holocaust Memorial Day commemorations you've been involved in, but was this one for you special in some way, Martin?
Very special indeed. It's a turning point. The turning point is from talking about the extremes and leaving an impression of something that is either completely black or completely white, to an approach which provokes questions about everybody.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very nuanced discussion and an absolutely fascinating one. Dr. Rachel Sentry, Dr. Martin Stern, Julia Boyd, thank you very much to all of you.